Why you wouldn't last a day in medieval Europe. Introduction. Imagine waking up not in your bed, not in your warm apartment, but on a bed of straw, the air thick with smoke from a fire that barely warms your room, in every corner, and the church bell tolls, not for morning prayers, but for yet another funeral. Medieval Europe has often been romanticized. Knights in shining armor, ladies in tall towers, bustling markets, and grand castles. But the truth was far from glamorous. For the average person, daily life was brutal, filthy, and terrifying. This is not the story of kings or queens. This is the story of ordinary life of peasants, craftsmen, women, and children. And if you, a modern person, were suddenly dropped into the middle of it all, you wouldn't last a day. Chapter 1. The daily life of a peasant. The vast majority of people in medieval Europe were peasants, serfs tied to the land of a lord. Forget about freedom of movement or choosing your career. Your job was decided the moment you were born, and your entire life revolved around the fields. A peasant's day began at dawn, often with the sound of the church bell. Before you could even rub the sleep from your eyes, you'd be expected to head out to the fields, plowing, sowing, harvesting, depending on the season. There were no weekends. The concept of time off simply didn't exist, and the work was backbreaking. Wooden plows pulled by oxen, crude tools, endless hours under the sun or in the rain. You worked until your hands blistered, and when those blisters burst, you kept working. Food was meager. Most peasants ate dark bread made of rye or barley, thin vegetable soups, and maybe some onions or cabbage. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for feasts and often only for the wealthier. If you were lucky, you might get a piece of salted pork or some dried fish. But most days, your diet was monotonous and insufficient. And don't think you'd come home to a cozy cottage. A peasant's home was usually a single room shared with the entire family, and sometimes with the animals too. Chickens, pigs, even goats often lived inside, both for warmth and for protection against thieves. The smoke from the hearth had nowhere to go, filling the room and stinging your eyes. Windows? If you had them at all, they were tiny holes stuffed with cloth or thin animal skin, not glass. Privacy didn't exist. You slept shoulder to shoulder with your family, often on a pile of straw crawling with lice and fleas. If you're cringing already, remember, there were no showers, no soap as we know it, no toothpaste, no deodorant. You washed maybe once or twice a year, if that. And then there was the Lord. Not only did you work your own fields, but you were also required to work his. At least a third of your time was spent laboring for the landowner, plowing his fields, repairing his fences, harvesting his crops. On top of that, you paid taxes, often in the form of grain, eggs, or livestock. Fail to pay and you could lose everything. It wasn't just the Lord you had to worry about. The church demanded its tithe, 10% of everything you earned, whether or not you could afford it. Priest preached that suffering was part of God's plan, and you should endure it patiently for the reward of heaven. And yet, despite all this, peasants found ways to survive. Community was everything. Neighbors helped each other repair homes, share food, and celebrate small festivals. But for you, a modern person used to supermarkets, hot showers, and weekends off, the sheer grind of peasant life would crush you within days. Chapter 2. The stench and disease of medieval towns. If you thought the countryside was rough, the towns and cities of medieval Europe were even worse. Forget the romanticized picture of charming cobblestone streets and bustling markets. In reality, towns were crowded, filthy, and dangerous breeding grounds for disease. Imagine stepping into a medieval street. The first thing you would notice is the smell. Human waste, animal dung, rotting food, and stagnant water all mixed together into an unbearable stench. There were no sewage systems as we know them today. Instead, chamber pots were emptied straight into the street. People would shout "Gardy Lou," a warning in some parts of Europe, before dumping the contents of their pots out the window. If you weren't careful, you'd end up with yesterday's dinner poured right over your head. The streets themselves were narrow and poorly maintained. In many towns, they were little more than muddy pathways with deep ruts. When it rained, everything turned into a foul swamp of sludge, manure, and waste. Rats thrived in this environment, and with them came fleas, the carriers of the Black Death. Water was another problem. Most people drank ale or weak beer because water was often unsafe. Wells were easily contaminated by waste from nearby latrines or by dead animals thrown into rivers upstream. If you dared to drink unboiled water, you risked dysentery or cholera, both of which could kill you in days. Markets were loud and bustling, full of traders shouting their goods. Meat hung on hooks swarming with flies. Fish sat out in the sun until it stank. Bread was often adulterated with sand or chalk to make it heavier and more profitable for the baker. And food poisoning was common. A single bad meal could mean days of agony or death. The houses in towns weren't much better. They were tall, narrow, and crammed together so closely that neighbors could shake hands through their windows. Fire was a constant danger. One careless spark and an entire street could go up in flames. Inside these homes, things were hardly more comfortable than in the countryside. Most people lived in 1 or 2 rooms, entire families packed together with little ventilation. Candles and oil lamps filled the air with smoke. Chimneys were rare, so soot blackened the walls and ceilings. And then there was disease. Leprosy, dysentery, tuberculosis, smallpox, and of course, the plague. In the mid-14th century, the Black Death swept through Europe, wiping out between 1/3 and half of the population. Imagine entire streets where every house had bodies inside, corpses piled in carts, the air filled with the sound of church bells tolling for the dead. Even before and after the plague, epidemics were constant. Fevers and infections that we cure easily today were deadly back then. A simple cut on your foot could fester, turn septic, and kill you in days. Doctors were few, and their methods often did more harm than good. Bloodletting, leeches, strange herbal concoctions, none of it truly worked. If you were sick and poor, you were left to pray and hope. If you were rich, you might get a physician, but their cures often hastened death rather than prevented it. And yet people kept living in towns. Why? Serfs who managed to escape to a city and live there for a year and a day without being caught could legally gain their freedom. Markets, guilds, and the possibility of a slightly better life drew people in, even if it meant risking disease and squalor. For a modern person, though, the reality of medieval towns would be unbearable. The smell alone would make you gag. The food would sicken you, and the constant threat of disease would keep you in fear. And if you thought you could just stay clean and avoid it, forget it. In a medieval town, filth was everywhere. Strange medieval medicine. If you fell ill in medieval Europe, and sooner or later you would, the so-called medical care available to you would likely make your condition worse, not better. Modern medicine didn't exist. Instead, health was a strange mixture of superstition, religion, and guesswork. The dominant medical theory of the time was the doctrine of the 4 humors. Doctors believed that your body was made up of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to be caused by an imbalance of these humors. If you had a fever, you supposedly had too much blood. If you were depressed, it was too much black bile. And so the cure was to drain or purge the offending humor. This is where bloodletting came in. One of the most common treatments for nearly every ailment involved cutting open a vein or applying leeches to suck out blood. Got a headache? Lose some blood. Fever? More blood. Stomachache? You guessed it, bloodletting. Patients often became weaker, sometimes dying faster from the treatment than from the original illness. If that didn't work, there were always purges and emetics. Physicians would give you powerful laxatives to flush out excess humors, leaving you dehydrated and miserable. Or they might induce vomiting to empty your stomach of corruption. For broken bones or injuries, there was little real help. A surgeon might attempt to set a bone using wooden splints, but pain relief was crude. Usually alcohol or simply biting down on leather. Amputations were carried out with no anesthesia, just raw speed and brute force. Infection was almost guaranteed. And then there were the bizarre remedies. Some doctors recommended drinking potions made of ground-up gems, powdered mummies, or even animal dung. Mercury was sometimes prescribed even though it's poisonous. Herbs like wormwood or mandrake were used, not because they were effective, but because they were part of tradition or carried mystical associations. Religion played a huge role. Illness was often seen as punishment from God for sin. Pilgrimages to holy sites, touching relics, or buying indulgences were considered just as valid treatments as any herbal potion. Monasteries kept herb gardens and monks served as healers, but their remedies were often little more than prayers mixed with primitive ointments. For the poor, there was no access to physicians at all. Instead, they relied on folk healers and wise women, who used charms, chants, and local herbs. Some remedies did have genuine benefits. Garlic, honey, and willow bark were surprisingly effective, but most were hit or miss. And if a woman's cures worked too well, she might be accused of witchcraft. Dentistry was another nightmare. If you had a toothache, the only real solution was extraction. Barbers often doubled as dentists, yanking teeth out with crude pliers and filthy conditions. Pain relief was minimal, and infections could easily spread to the jaw or brain. Mental illness was almost completely misunderstood. Melancholy, epilepsy, or hallucinations were often seen as signs of demonic possession. Treatments ranged from exorcisms to trepanning, the practice of drilling a hole in the skull to release evil spirits. Many patients didn't survive. Even childbirth was deadly. Midwives helped deliver babies, but complications were common, and without surgical knowledge or hygiene, many mothers and infants died. Women sometimes turned to amulets, prayers, or even swallowing crushed gemstones in desperate attempts to survive labor. In short, medieval medicine was as dangerous as the diseases it tried to treat. If you were lucky, your illness might pass on its own. If not, the cure would kill you before the sickness did. Food, drink, and everyday diet. When people imagine medieval feasts, they often picture long tables piled high with roasted meats, goblets of wine, and endless platters of fruit. But that was the fantasy of the nobility. The daily reality for most of medieval Europe was far grimmer. For peasants, food was repetitive, meager, and often spoiled. The backbone of the diet was bread, but not the fluffy white loaves you know today. Peasant bread was dark, coarse, and heavy, made from rye, barley, or oats. Sometimes it was mixed with ground-up beans, chestnuts, or even sawdust to make it last longer. Sand and grit often got into the flour during grinding, which wore down people's teeth to stubs by middle age. Alongside bread came pottage, a kind of thick vegetable stew made of whatever was on hand: onions, leeks, turnips, or cabbage. It simmered in a pot all day, with family members dipping bread into it for every meal. Meat was rare for peasants. A bit of salted pork or bacon fat might flavor the stew, but often the pottage was entirely vegetarian. For protein, peasants relied on beans, peas, and occasionally eggs or dairy. Cheese was common, but it was sour, hard, and far less appetizing than what you buy in a store today. Milk was mostly given to children, since adults often couldn't digest it well. If you were lucky, you might catch fish, but unless you lived near the sea or a good river, fresh fish was hard to come by. More often it was salted or dried, and by the time you ate it, the taste was overpowering. And then there was beer and ale. Almost everyone drank it, including children, because water was unsafe. The ale was weak, more like liquid bread than the strong beers we know today, but it was safer than drinking from a contaminated well. Wine was mostly reserved for the wealthy, though in southern Europe it was more common and could be watered down for daily drinking. The nobility, of course, ate far better. Their feasts really did feature roasted swan, venison, or boar. Spices like cinnamon, ginger, and pepper were highly prized, imported at enormous cost from Asia. A dish spiced with cloves or saffron wasn't just a meal, it was a status symbol. But even noble meals had their horrors. Meat was often undercooked, preserved poorly, or flavored heavily with spices to cover up the fact that it was going bad. Food safety simply didn't exist. Parasites, food poisoning, and stomach worms were a constant hazard. Sugar was rare and expensive, more like medicine than dessert. Instead, sweets were made with honey. Cakes and pastries existed, but only the upper classes enjoyed them regularly. For peasants, a bit of honey or fruit was the closest thing to a treat. Seasonality was everything. In the summer and autumn, there was fresh produce. In the winter, you survived on salted meat, dried beans, and whatever you managed to store in your cellar. Starvation was never far away. A bad harvest could mean hunger for an entire village, and don't forget fasting. The medieval church dictated dozens of fast days throughout the year, when people were forbidden to eat meat, eggs, or dairy. Fish was the main substitute. But for peasants who couldn't afford it, these fasts meant going hungry. Dining manners weren't what you'd expect either. Forks were rare until the late Middle Ages, so most people ate with their hands, knives, or spoons carved from wood. Shared bowls and communal drinking cups were the norm. If you were unlucky, you might share more than just a cup. You might also share someone's disease. For a modern person, adjusting to the medieval diet would be shocking. No sugar, no coffee, no chocolate, no potatoes, no tomatoes. None of these foods had reached Europe yet. Instead, day after day, you'd face coarse bread, watery stew, sour cheese, and weak ale. Within a week, you'd be dreaming of fast food. Within a month, your teeth would ache, your stomach would revolt, and your body would weaken from malnutrition. Crime, punishment, and tortured justice in medieval Europe was brutal, public, and often terrifyingly random. Forget about fair trials or modern legal rights. If you were accused of a crime, your fate depended less on evidence and more on superstition, confession under torture, or the whim of a judge. For peasants, even small offenses could bring severe punishments. Steal a loaf of bread? You might be flogged in the town square. Cheat your neighbor? You could be fined more than you could ever afford. Repeat offenders often faced mutilation, losing an ear, a hand, or even being branded with hot iron so everyone would know you were a thief. Serious crimes, of course, brought death. Execution was not just about punishment, it was about spectacle. It was designed to scare the population into obedience. In towns, gallows were placed in open areas so everyone could watch as criminals were hanged, strangled, or burned. Hanging was the most common punishment. Criminals were often left dangling for hours, their bodies swaying in the wind as a grim reminder to others. In some regions, executioners left corpses to rot in cages known as gibbets, so the stench of decay would warn travelers of the price of crime. Burning at the stake was used not only for heretics and witches, but also for arsonists and sometimes counterfeiters. It was slow, agonizing, and horrifyingly public. Crowds gathered as flames engulfed the condemned, church officials standing by to preach repentance while the victims screamed. Beheading was reserved for nobles, considered a more honorable death. But without a sharp blade or a skilled executioner, it could take multiple blows to sever a head. Witness accounts describe heads half-hanging from bodies, blood spraying across horrified onlookers. Then there were the trial by ordeal methods, grim tests, meant to let God decide guilt or innocence. You might be forced to plunge your arm into boiling water. If the wound healed cleanly, you were innocent. Or you could be bound and thrown into a river. If you floated, you were guilty of witchcraft. If you sank, you were innocent, but often dead. Torture was officially regulated by the church and state, but widely used. The rack stretched victims until joints popped from their sockets. The strappado suspended people by their arms until shoulders dislocated. Iron boots crushed legs with wedges hammered between metal plates. The goal wasn't always to punish, it was to extract confessions. And confessions once given were considered proof of guilt, even if they came through unimaginable agony. Innocent or not, once you confessed under torture, your fate was sealed. But not all punishments were deadly. Some were humiliating. The stocks and pillories locked offenders in place in the center of town, where passers-by pelted them with rotten vegetables, mud, or worse. Adulterers, drunkards, and liars could spend days on display, mocked and abused by their neighbors. Executioners themselves were both feared and despised. They were necessary but tainted by the work they did. Many lived outside the walls of towns, isolated from society, and yet when justice was needed, everyone watched them work. For a modern person, the cruelty of medieval justice would be unbearable. Imagine being whipped bloody for gossiping, losing a hand for theft, or burned alive for disagreeing with church doctrine. The message was clear. The law was not about fairness, it was about control through fear. War and the horrors of battle. When most people think of medieval warfare, they picture knights in shining armor clashing on horseback, banners flying, swords gleaming. But the reality of war in medieval Europe was far more brutal, filthy, and terrifying than any storybook battle. First, war wasn't only fought between knights. In fact, knights were a minority. The bulk of medieval armies was made up of peasants, poor men pulled from fields armed with crude spears, axes, or even farming tools. They had little training and even less armor. Against a mounted knight, they were slaughtered in droves. Battles were chaotic, not the organized duels you might imagine. Clouds of arrows rained down before the armies even clashed, piercing armor, blinding horses, and striking peasants who had no protection. A single volley could kill hundreds. When the armies finally collided, it was carnage. Soldiers hacked at one another in close quarters, slipping in mud slick with blood. Bodies piled on bodies, and the noise was deafening. The clash of metal, the screams of the wounded, the shouts of commanders, the neighing of panicked horses. Armor, too, was not as protective as movies suggest. A knight in full plate could resist many blows, but such armor was rare until the late Middle Ages and was crushingly heavy. Most men fought in padded gambesons or chainmail, which offered little against a sharp lance or a well-aimed arrow. And if you fell in battle, your chances of survival were slim. There were no field hospitals, no medics rushing in to save you. If you were wounded, you bled where you fell. If you were lucky, a comrade might drag you away. If not, scavengers or your enemies finished the job. But the battlefield itself was only part of the horror. War in the Middle Ages often meant raiding and pillaging. When armies passed through villages, peasants bore the brunt of their fury. Crops were burned, livestock stolen, homes destroyed. Men were slaughtered. Women violated, children left to starve. For civilians, war was a nightmare without escape. Sieges were another terror. Castles and fortified towns were designed to withstand attack, which meant battles often dragged on for months. Inside, food supplies dwindled and people were forced to eat rats, dogs, even leather. Disease spread rapidly among the trapped population. Outside the walls, besiegers suffered too, living in muddy camps filled with lice and plague. To break a siege, attackers used cruel methods. Siege engines hurled boulders, fire, or even diseased corpses over the walls to spread pestilence. Miners dug tunnels to collapse towers, while sappers set fires against the gates. If a castle fell, the defenders could expect no mercy. Massacres were common, with survivors sold into slavery or executed on the spot. Knights, often glamorized, were not always noble heroes. Many were ruthless mercenaries fighting for gold rather than honor. They killed without hesitation, looted villages, and sometimes even turned on their own employers if the money ran out. Prisoners of war faced grim fates. Wealthy knights might be ransomed for huge sums, but peasants were worthless. Captured commoners were often executed en masse or mutilated to serve as warnings to others. And beyond the battlefield lurked famine and disease. Armies carried plague with them, spreading illness wherever they marched. Entire regions were devastated, not just by the sword, but by the hunger and pestilence that followed in war's wake. For a modern person, even witnessing such a battle would be overwhelming. The stench of blood and rot, the deafening sounds, the sheer chaos would be enough to break you. Surviving one day in medieval war would scar you for life if you survived at all. Religion, superstition, and fear of the devil. To live in medieval Europe was to live under the constant shadow of the church. Religion wasn't simply a matter of personal faith. It controlled nearly every aspect of life, from how you worked and ate to how you thought and feared. Every town and village revolved around its church. Bells marked the hours of the day, summoning people to prayer or announcing death. The church calendar dictated when you could marry, when you could eat meat, when you could celebrate, and when you must fast. Nearly a third of the year was spent in religious fasting. The church taught that the world was a battlefield between God and the devil, and that every soul was caught in between. To step out of line, to disobey, to doubt, was to risk eternal damnation. Hell was not an abstract idea. It was a vivid, ever-present threat. Preachers described it in gruesome detail: pits of fire, demons with claws, endless torment. For peasants who had little joy in life, the fear of suffering even more after death was overwhelming. Superstition filled the gaps where religion ended. The night was full of terrors: witches, demons, ghosts, and creatures of the forest. People believed that sickness might come from a curse, that storms could be the devil's work, that a poor harvest was punishment from God. Charms, amulets, and holy relics were carried everywhere, protection against the unseen. The sale of relics became a thriving trade. Pieces of saints' bones, fragments of the true cross, even feathers supposedly from angels were sold to believers for money. Most were fakes, but to the faithful, they were shields against misfortune. Pilgrimages to shrines were common. Journeys that took weeks or months on dangerous roads, all in the hope of healing or forgiveness. Fear of heresy was another constant. To question the teachings of the church was to risk your life. Heretics were hunted, tried, and burned. Ordinary people were expected to denounce neighbors who strayed from orthodoxy. Suspicion alone could ruin lives. Witchcraft was feared, especially during times of famine or plague. Wise women, midwives, or simply eccentric old women were often accused of consorting with the devil. Though the peak of witch hunts came later, in the early modern period, the seeds of fear were already present in medieval life. Monasteries and monks offered some comfort: prayers, charity, education. But they too lived under strict rules of poverty, chastity, and obedience. For common people, monasteries were mysterious places of power, where men lived apart from society, devoting themselves to God in silence and labor. Even natural phenomena were interpreted through a religious lens. An eclipse was a sign of God's anger. A comet foretold disaster. Lightning striking a church might be seen as punishment for hidden sins. Few people dared to think in terms of science. The church discouraged it, reminding everyone that God's will explained all things. In times of plague, people turned to extreme measures. Flagellants marched through towns whipping themselves bloody, begging God to lift his wrath. Others accused Jews, foreigners, or witches of poisoning wells, leading to horrific massacres. Fear fed fear, and religion became both comfort and weapon. For a modern person, Used to skepticism and scientific explanations, the all-consuming power of medieval religion would be suffocating. There was no escape from it. Every illness, every storm, every death was tied to sin, demons, or divine judgment. To live in that world meant to live constantly afraid of the devil, afraid of neighbors' suspicion, and most of all, afraid of eternity in hell. The harsh life of women in medieval Europe. If life was brutal for men in medieval Europe, for women it was often even harsher. From birth to death, a woman's existence was shaped by limitations, dangers, and expectations that left little room for freedom. Most women were born into peasant families. From the moment they could walk, girls were expected to work, tending animals, gathering firewood, spinning wool, helping with the harvest. Childhood ended quickly. By the age of 12 or 13, a girl might already be married off. Marriage was not a matter of love, but of survival, alliances, and property. For many, marriage was a trap. A woman was legally and socially bound to obey her husband. She had little say in household decisions, and divorce was almost impossible under church law. If her husband was cruel or violent, she had no real recourse. Beatings were considered a normal part of discipline, and the church often reinforced the idea that women must endure suffering in silence. Childbirth was one of the greatest dangers a woman faced. Without modern medicine, complications like hemorrhage, infection, or breech birth were often fatal. Midwives assisted, but their knowledge was limited, and superstition sometimes replaced genuine care. Many women died in their teens or 20s after giving birth to their first or second child. Even if they survived, losing infants to disease or malnutrition was heartbreakingly common. Families expected that only half of their children might live to adulthood. For noble women, life was different, but not necessarily easier. While they lived in castles instead of huts, they were still bound by arranged marriages and the duty to produce heirs. They might be educated in reading, embroidery, or courtly manners, but their primary value was in strengthening alliances between families. A noble woman could find herself married to a man decades older, with no choice in the matter. Some women sought refuge in convents. Becoming a nun offered a rare escape from marriage, allowing women to live in communities devoted to prayer, work, and education. Convents preserved knowledge, copied manuscripts, and sometimes provided basic medical care. Yet even in convents, women lived under strict rules and heavy discipline. Widows sometimes had more freedom, especially if they inherited property from their husbands. In towns, some women became merchants, brewers, or ran small businesses. But such cases were exceptions, and even successful women were viewed with suspicion. Too much independence could lead to accusations of witchcraft or immorality. Sexuality was tightly controlled by both law and religion. Adultery could result in public humiliation or severe punishment, often harsher for women than for men. Prostitution existed openly in many towns, tolerated by authorities as a necessary evil. But prostitutes were scorned, vulnerable, and often subjected to disease and violence. Education for women was rare. A few noble women or nuns became literate, writing letters, prayers, or poetry. But for most, knowledge was limited to oral traditions, folk remedies, and skills needed for survival. Women also carried the weight of superstition. If a cow stopped giving milk, if crops failed, if a child grew sick, suspicion often fell on women. Wise women who practiced herbal healing could just as easily be celebrated or condemned. One day she was the midwife who saved your child. The next she was the witch who cursed your family. For a modern person, the lack of rights, the constant danger of childbirth, the forced marriages, and the daily grind of labor would feel like imprisonment. In medieval Europe, being a woman was to live under constant control by fathers, husbands, the church, and society itself. Independence was rare, and survival often depended not on strength or ambition, but on endurance. Childhood and growing up in the Middle Ages. To be a child in medieval Europe was to live a life that, by modern standards, hardly felt like childhood at all. The idea of childhood as a protected, carefree stage of life simply didn't exist. From the moment you could walk and talk, you were expected to work, obey, and endure. Infancy itself was perilous. Nearly half of all children died before reaching the age of 5. Disease, malnutrition, and accidents claimed countless young lives. Mothers might have many children, but they expected that only a few would survive into adulthood. Death in the cradle was so common that it was often met with resignation rather than shock. For those who survived, Childhood quickly meant responsibility. Peasant children helped their parents in the fields, tending animals, gathering water, chopping wood, or caring for younger siblings. By the age of 7, many children were already working as much as adults, their small bodies bent under heavy loads. Play existed, but it was simple. Wooden dolls, carved animals, balls made of rags. Any free moment was a luxury. Education was rare. In villages, children might never learn to read or write. Instead, they were taught the skills needed to survive: farming, spinning, weaving, cooking, hunting. In towns, boys could sometimes attend cathedral schools or become apprentices, learning trades like blacksmithing, carpentry, or tailoring. Girls, meanwhile, were often taught domestic tasks to prepare them for marriage. Apprenticeship was both opportunity and hardship. A boy of 10 or 12 might be sent away to live with a master craftsman. He would work long hours in exchange for food, lodging, and training, often enduring harsh discipline. For many, it was the only path to a stable future. Noble children lived differently, but their lives were no less strict. Sons of knights were sent to other households as pages, serving noble families while learning horsemanship, swordsmanship, and manners. By 14, a page might become a squire, shadowing a knight in battle, polishing armor, and training endlessly. Chivalry sounded glamorous, but in reality it was brutal preparation for a life of war. Noble daughters were raised to be wives. They learned embroidery, music, dancing, and religious devotion. By their teens, they were ready for arranged marriages, sometimes to men they had never met. Their futures were decided long before they had any say. Childhood was also marked by religion and superstition. From an early age, children were taught about sin, hell, and obedience to God. Disobedience to parents was not just rebellion. It was considered a sin punishable by eternal damnation. Beatings were seen as normal discipline, believed to drive out the devil from unruly children. Games and festivals did bring moments of joy. Children played tag, wrestled, or imitated adults with toy weapons. At fairs, they laughed at jugglers, acrobats, and animal shows. On holy days, even the poor enjoyed rare treats and music. But such moments were fleeting compared to the daily grind of labor and fear. Perhaps the harshest reality of medieval childhood was how quickly it ended. By the age of 12 or 13, you were considered an adult ready to marry, work, or fight. A girl might become a wife and mother before she was even fully grown. A boy might be sent to war while still barely more than a child himself. For a modern person, the absence of safety, education, and play would be shocking. Death, burial, and the medieval obsession with the afterlife. If there was one certainty in medieval Europe, it was death. Life was short, brutal, and uncertain, and people lived with death so closely that it shaped almost every part of their culture. For most, reaching the age of 40 was considered old. Many never lived past their 20s. Disease, famine, and war struck without warning. One year you might be working your fields. The next, your entire village could be wiped out by plague or burned in conflict. Death was never far away. It lurked in every fever, every wound, every bad harvest. The church constantly reminded people of their mortality. Paintings and carvings depicted skeletons, demons, and the flames of hell. Sermons warned of sudden death and eternal damnation. The concept of memento mori, remember you will die, was not just a phrase but a way of life. Burial customs reflected this obsession. The poor were often buried in simple wooden coffins, or sometimes none at all, placed directly in the earth of crowded churchyards. Graves were shallow, and bones from older burials were sometimes dug up to make room for new ones. Ossuaries, chambers filled with skulls and bones, were common reminders that death came for everyone. The wealthy sought elaborate tombs, carved effigies, and eternal prayers. Nobles might be buried inside churches, their stone likenesses staring upward in frozen devotion. Kings and bishops commissioned entire chapels to ensure their souls would be remembered and prayed for. The afterlife was the great preoccupation. Heaven was promised to the righteous, but purgatory, an in-between state of suffering, was feared just as much as hell. People paid for masses to be said for their souls after death, hoping to shorten their suffering. Wealthy families left money to monasteries to guarantee endless prayers. For the poor, hope rested in faith and the mercy of God. Plagues made death even more visible. During the Black Death, entire towns became graveyards. Mass pits were dug, filled with bodies stacked layer upon layer. Priests read hurried prayers over heaps of corpses, unable to keep up with the dead. Survivors lived with the stench of decay and the constant tolling of funeral bells. Superstitions surrounded death as well. People believed ghosts roamed the earth, that improper burials led to restless spirits. Charms and rituals were used to protect the living from the anger of the dead. Stories of revenants, corpses rising from their graves, fed fears that the boundary between life and death was fragile. For a modern person, the sheer presence of death in everyday life would be overwhelming. Today, death is hidden away in hospitals and cemeteries. In the Middle Ages, it was at your doorstep, in your home, and in your fields. Children played beside churchyards filled with open graves. Families watched loved ones die slowly at home, powerless to help. In the end, the medieval obsession with death was not morbid curiosity, it was survival. By constantly reminding themselves that life was short and uncertain, people clung to their faith and their hope for eternity. But for someone from the modern world, where medicine, safety, and long life are expected, the closeness of death in medieval Europe would be unthinkable. Conclusion: why you wouldn't last a day. By now you've walked through every corner of life in medieval Europe. Peasants in their fields, towns filled with filth and disease, strange medicine, meager food, brutal justice, endless war, suffocating religion, the harsh lives of women, the lost childhood of children, and the constant presence of death. And when you put it all together, one thing becomes clear. If you, as a modern person, were dropped into this world, you wouldn't last a day. Let's imagine it. You wake up in a peasant hut, the smell of smoke and animals filling your lungs. Your straw bed is crawling with lice. You haven't bathed in months, and neither has anyone else. Before you can eat, you're out in the fields working from dawn until dusk with tools so crude they blister your hands within an hour. And when you finally return home, all you have to eat is stale bread and watery stew. Now imagine falling sick. A fever strikes, and instead of antibiotics or doctors, a priest tells you to confess your sins while a barber surgeon bleeds you with a rusty knife. You grow weaker by the hour, your family praying desperately while neighbors whisper that you might be cursed. Your fate isn't in the hands of medicine. It's in the balance of superstition, chance, and faith. Suppose you live in a town. You step outside and immediately gag at the stench of waste in the streets. Rats scurry at your feet, fleas biting at your ankles. A market stall sells fish that's been rotting in the sun since yesterday. You drink weak ale instead of water, because the well is poisoned with filth. And if you fall ill, you know that half your neighbors will die before the year is over, victims of plague or famine. Or imagine facing the law. You're accused of stealing, though you're innocent. Evidence doesn't matter. You're dragged into the town square, chained in the stocks, pelted with rotten food by your neighbors. If you're unlucky, you might be whipped bloody or branded for life. And if the accusation is heresy or witchcraft, your only hope is a trial by ordeal, plunging your arm into boiling water or being thrown into a river to see if you float. Now picture war. Your lord calls you to fight, handing you a spear and sending you against mounted knights. The battlefield is chaos, mud, blood, and screams all around. Arrows fall like rain, cutting men down by the hundreds. You see friends disemboweled, horses collapsing, fires consuming villages. If you survive the battle, you may still die days later from an infected wound. And through it all, religion looms. You live in fear of sin, of demons, of hell. Every misfortune is a punishment from God. Every death a reminder that eternity hangs over you. Questioning this system is unthinkable. Heresy means death. For women, life is narrower still. Married off as teenagers, burdened with childbirth that often kills them. Bound by laws that give them no rights. For children, play is a rare luxury. Work a constant demand, death a familiar companion. For everyone, life is short, painful, and filled with fear. And death itself never leaves you. You bury half your children before they can walk. You see neighbors carried to mass graves during plague years. You pass through churchyards where bones lie piled in ossuaries. Silent warnings that one day soon you will join them. For us today, life expectancy, comfort, and medicine make survival almost effortless by comparison. We take for granted clean water, safe food, painkillers, vaccines, and basic human rights. In the Middle Ages, even the wealthiest were vulnerable to disease, betrayal, and sudden death. And the poor, the overwhelming majority, endured suffering beyond anything we can easily imagine. So why wouldn't you last a day in medieval Europe? Because everything we depend on to survive simply didn't exist. Hygiene, medicine, fairness, nutrition, safety, freedom. Strip all of it away, and you're left with a world that chewed people up and spat them out. A world where survival itself was a daily battle, and yet people did survive, they endured. They laughed at festivals, prayed in churches, sang songs, told stories, and clung to hope. They built the foundations of the world we live in today, not by living comfortably, but by enduring hardship so profound that we can scarcely comprehend it. But for you, for any modern person suddenly transported back in time, one day would be enough. One day before hunger, filth, disease, or violence crushed you. One day before you realize just how far we've come, and just how brutal the world once was. The Black Death and the horror of plague. If there was one event that defined the terror of the Middle Ages, it was the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, Europe was struck by a plague so devastating that it wiped out nearly half the population. Imagine walking through your town and realizing that every second person you knew, neighbors, family, friends, was dead within weeks. That was the grim reality of the Black Death. It began like so many disasters far away. Traders returning from the east carried rats aboard their ships, and with the rats came fleas, and with the fleas came a silent killer. The disease spread rapidly across trade routes, striking down city after city with terrifying speed. In some places, entire communities were gone within months. The symptoms were horrifying. People developed swellings called buboes under their arms, on their necks, or in their groins. These lumps grew to the size of apples, black and foul-smelling. Victims spat blood. Their skin turned dark with necrosis, and they often died within just 3 days. Families watched loved ones collapse in agony, powerless to help. The fear was indescribable. Doctors had no idea what caused the plague. Some blamed bad air, the alignment of the planets, or God's wrath. The church urged repentance, but even priests died in droves, leaving parishes abandoned. Some people turned to flagellation, marching in processions, whipping themselves bloody, begging for mercy. Others accused minorities, especially Jews, of poisoning wells, leading to mass pogroms and massacres. Cities became death traps, streets filled with carts carrying the bodies of the dead. Bell towers rang constantly, tolling for funerals that never seemed to end. In many towns, the dead outnumbered the living so heavily that there was no one left to bury them. Mass graves were dug, filled with layer upon layer of corpses, and the stench carried for miles. Fear destroyed social bonds, parents abandoned sick children, husbands left dying wives, neighbors barred their doors, refusing to help one another. Rich men fled to the countryside, thinking distance would save them, but the plague followed everywhere. No village, no monastery, no castle was safe. The sheer randomness was terrifying. Some households lost everyone, while next door, families survived untouched. People looked for meaning in the chaos. Some believed it was the end of the world. Others clung desperately to charms, relics, or prayers, hoping for divine protection. But nothing worked. By the time the first wave ended, millions were dead. Entire villages were left deserted, fields overgrown, houses collapsing into ruin. Trade routes shut down, towns shrank, and labor became scarce. For a time, survivors saw strange benefits, wages rose, land became available, but the trauma lingered for generations. Imagine being a modern person dropped into that nightmare. No understanding of germs, no antibiotics, no hospitals to treat the sick. You would walk through streets filled with corpses, breathe the stench of decay, and know that at any moment the same fate might strike you. To survive the Black Death was not just luck, it was a miracle. The plague did not vanish after the 14th century. It returned again and again in smaller outbreaks, haunting Europe for centuries. Every time fear and death followed. And every time people wondered, was this God's punishment? Or was there something darker? Something beyond human understanding lurking in the shadows of their world?
Castles and the harsh life of nobility. When we think of medieval castles, we imagine fairy tales, towering walls, glittering banquets, knights in shining armor, and kings on golden thrones.
But the truth of castle life was far less romantic. Castles were not palaces of comfort. They were fortresses of stone built for defense, not luxury. And for those who lived inside, even nobles, life could be cold, dark, and suffocating. A castle was first and foremost a military stronghold. Its thick walls kept enemies out, but they also kept cold and dampness in. In winter, the interiors froze. In summer, the stench of unwashed bodies, smoke from fires, and waste from latrines filled the air. Imagine trying to sleep in a drafty hall with only straw mats, your breath visible in the frigid night, rats scurrying across the floor. The Great Hall was the heart of the castle. It was where the lord ate, where disputes were settled, and where visitors were received. But don't picture golden chandeliers and sparkling silverware. The hall was smoky, noisy, and crowded. Fires burned constantly in open hearths, but their smoke often hung in the air, blackening the walls and choking the lungs. Dogs wandered freely, scraps of food scattered across the rushes that covered the floor. These rushes, bundles of straw and herbs, were meant to absorb spills, but they quickly became infested with fleas and filth. Meals were grand in scale, but not in hygiene. Dozens or even hundreds of people crammed into the hall during a feast. Nobles at the high table, retainers and servants below. Food was plentiful for the elite. Roasted boars, swans, pies filled with game, heavily spiced stews. But it was not always fresh. Meat often had to be preserved with salt, and spices were used to disguise the taste of decay. Bones and scraps were thrown onto the floor, where dogs and servants picked them clean. Forks were unknown to most people. Guests ate with knives, spoons, or bare hands, wiping greasy fingers on their clothes or the nearest dog. But food was only part of noble life. Politics and intrigue were everywhere. Nobles lived under constant pressure to prove loyalty to their liege, to arrange marriages that secured alliances, and to survive in a world where betrayal was common. Poisonings were whispered about in courts, rivalries flared into feuds, and a careless word could mean exile, or worse. For women in castles, life was equally stifling. A noblewoman might appear wealthy, clothed in fine fabrics, but her life was often one of endless childbirth, managing households, and acting as a pawn in political marriages. While some women wielded influence behind the scenes, many were trapped by duty, with little control over their own destinies. And always there was the threat of siege. A castle that looked magnificent in peacetime could become a prison when enemies surrounded it. Supplies dwindled, disease spread, and the fear of starvation gnawed at everyone inside. Archers stood watch on the battlements day and night, while below families huddled in the dark, praying the walls would hold. If the enemy broke through, the slaughter was merciless. Nobles could be captured for ransom, but servants and commoners were often killed outright. Even when not at war, castles were dangerous places. Fires spread quickly in wooden towers. Accidents were common, falling from battlements, drowning in moats, or even being crushed by collapsing walls. Medical care, as always, was primitive, and nobles were no safer than peasants from fevers, infections, or sudden death. And let's not forget the noise. A castle was never quiet. Servants bustled, animals bleated, blacksmiths hammered, soldiers trained. Privacy was a rare luxury, even for lords and ladies. Most people shared rooms, and even noble chambers were often filled with attendants. For a modern person expecting comfort, privacy, and safety, castle life would be shocking. The grandeur of stone towers would quickly lose its charm when faced with the reality. Freezing halls, smoky air, spoiled food, and the constant fear of war or betrayal. To live in a castle was to live inside a fortress and a prison. Entertainment and festivals in a world of misery. It may seem strange to imagine, but in a world filled with hunger, disease, and war, people in medieval Europe still sought entertainment. In fact, perhaps it was precisely because life was so hard that people threw themselves so eagerly into festivals, games, and spectacles. Joy was rare, and when it came, it was loud, chaotic, and often brutal. For peasants, the church calendar provided many of these moments. Though religion demanded strict fasting and endless prayers, it also granted feast days, times when the daily grind of labor stopped, and the entire community gathered to celebrate. Christmas, Easter, and local saints' days meant processions, music, dancing, and food. On such days, villagers might roast animals, share ale, and play games. For a brief moment, hunger and fear gave way to laughter and merriment. Yet these celebrations were far from refined. Dancing was wild, music was rough, and drunkenness was rampant. Ale flowed freely, and so did tempers. Brawls often broke out, sometimes turning deadly. But still, peasants craved these festivals. They were one of the few times when life felt larger than survival. Markets and fairs brought more excitement. Traveling performers entertained crowds with juggling, fire-breathing, and storytelling. Minstrels sang ballads of knights and romances, often embellishing tales to make them more thrilling. Puppet shows amused children, while gamblers threw dice in noisy corners. Merchants sold exotic goods, spices, fabrics, trinkets that few villagers could afford but all gawked at. And then there were the bloodier forms of entertainment. Animal baiting was popular. Dogs set upon chained bears or bulls cheered on by roaring crowds. Cockfighting, dogfighting, and other cruel spectacles drew bets and excitement. To the medieval mind, such violence was not disturbing. It was exhilarating, a reminder of power and survival. Public executions, too, became a kind of grim theater. When criminals were hanged, burned, or beheaded, entire towns turned out to watch. Children sat on their parents' shoulders as the condemned begged for mercy. Vendors sold food and minstrels sang songs of justice. For people hardened by daily brutality, watching death was not horrifying. It was expected, even entertaining. Nobles enjoyed their own diversions. Tournaments were grand displays of wealth and violence, where knights jousted with lances, clashed with swords, and sometimes died in front of roaring crowds. For the audience, it was thrilling. For the knights, it was both sport and deadly serious training for war. Banquets offered another kind of entertainment, though they were as much about excess as amusement. Nobles gorged on meat, drank heavily, and laughed at the performances of jesters, clowns who mocked, danced, and risked humiliation to make their lords laugh. Some jesters were witty and skilled, others relied on crude jokes and pratfalls. But all of them knew that failing to entertain could cost them their position, or worse. Even in towns, entertainment meant noise, spectacle, and chaos. Mystery plays performed by guilds, retold biblical stories in dramatic fashion, often with elaborate costumes and crude humor. These plays were both religious instruction and mass entertainment, teaching peasants about heaven and hell while making them laugh at devils chased off stage by angels with wooden swords. But alongside all this, darker forms of entertainment lurked. Carnival festivals often flipped the social order, with peasants mocking nobles, cross-dressing, and indulging in debauchery. For a few days, chaos reigned, but when the festival ended, life returned to its harsh reality. Some saw these moments as harmless release. Others feared them as dangerous glimpses of rebellion. For a modern person, the sheer rawness of medieval entertainment would be shocking. Joy was soaked in blood, laughter mixed with cruelty, and faith intertwined with spectacle. To feast one day and starve the next, to laugh at a jester and then cheer at an execution, that was the rhythm of life. In a world of misery, entertainment was not about comfort. It was about survival of the spirit. The Crusades, holy wars of blood and fire. The Crusades are often remembered as epic tales of knights in shining armor marching east to reclaim the Holy Land, banners waving, priests blessing their swords, and kings riding at the head of vast armies. But behind the romantic myths was a far darker truth. The Crusades were a storm of blood, famine, and fanaticism that left Europe and the Middle East drenched in suffering. It began with a speech. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd in Clermont, France, and called on Christians to march to Jerusalem, promising forgiveness of sins and eternal salvation to anyone who took the cross. His words ignited a frenzy. The poor, the desperate, the ambitious all felt called. For peasants, it was a chance to escape the misery of their fields. For knights, it was the lure of glory, wealth, and redemption. For kings, it was a way to extend power. But the first wave of crusaders was not an army, it was a mob. Tens of thousands of peasants, led by self-proclaimed prophets, wandered eastward with no supplies, no training, and no discipline. They plundered villages to survive, massacred Jewish communities in Germany, and starved long before they ever reached the Holy Land. For many, the crusade ended before it began, with corpses left rotting on the roads of Europe. Those who did reach the East faced horrors beyond imagination. The journey was long and merciless. Crusaders trudged across blistering deserts, armor baking in the sun, lips cracked with thirst. Horses died in droves and men followed soon after. Some resorted to drinking foul water, others to eating grass, leather, or even the flesh of fallen comrades. The Holy Land was not a land of glory. It was a furnace of suffering. And then came the sieges. Castles and fortified cities dotted the landscape, and each one became a graveyard. The siege of Antioch dragged on for months, with crusaders starving outside the walls. Men gnawed on boiled leather and rats. At the lowest point, some even turned to cannibalism, feasting on the bodies of the dead. Chroniclers tried to excuse these acts as survival, but the horror lingers in their words. When the Crusaders finally stormed Jerusalem in 1099, their victory was drowned in blood. Chroniclers described streets running with corpses, men wading ankle-deep in gore, and holy places desecrated as soldiers slaughtered Muslim and Jewish inhabitants alike. For the Crusaders, it was proof of God's favor. For the victims, it was nothing short of apocalypse. But the Crusades were not one-sided. Muslim leaders like Saladin rose to meet the invaders, uniting armies and striking back with equal ferocity. Crusaders who believed they were God's chosen found themselves crushed in battles, their holy mission undone by hunger, desert heat, and superior tactics. The Battle of Hattin in 1187 saw Crusader knights captured or killed in droves, their relics and banners seized. Survivors were enslaved or executed, their dreams of salvation ending in chains. And yet the Crusades did not end. Wave after wave followed, some led by kings like Richard the Lionheart, others by poor peasants swept up in new preaching. Each crusade carried the same mixture of faith and greed, zeal and brutality. Children were even sent in so-called children's crusades, thousands of them dying or being sold into slavery before they ever saw the Holy Land. The truth was simple. The Crusades were less about faith and more about power. Nobles carved out kingdoms in the East, merchants grew rich on trade, and the Church tightened its grip on Europe by promising salvation through violence. What was preached as holy war became a cycle of conquest, corruption, and endless death. For a modern person, the madness of the Crusades would be unthinkable. Imagine being told that killing strangers would cleanse your soul, that starving in the desert was the path to heaven, that sacrificing your children was the will of God. Imagine marching thousands of miles only to die nameless in the sands of a foreign land. The Crusades were not the glory of knights and kings. They were the agony of millions. They were holy wars of blood and fire, and their scars can still be seen in the world today. Money, trade, and the rise of corruption. When we picture medieval Europe, we often imagine a world without money. Peasants trading eggs for cloth, or lords ruling over self-sufficient estates. But by the High Middle Ages, trade and money were reshaping society, and with them came a new kind of power, wealth. And where there was wealth, there was corruption. Markets became the lifeblood of medieval towns. Merchants carried salt, grain, and wool, while others brought spices, silk, and exotic goods from distant lands. Fairs, like those in Champagne, turned sleepy towns into bustling centers where traders from across Europe gathered. For peasants who had never left their villages, the sights and smells were overwhelming. Saffron from the east, furs from Russia, glass from Venice. But trade was dangerous. Roads swarmed with bandits and sea routes were plagued by storms and pirates. A single journey could bring riches or ruin. Merchants often banded together in caravans or convoys for protection, and guilds formed to regulate trade, set prices, and ensure quality. These guilds gave craftsmen and traders security, but they also wielded enormous power, sometimes becoming as corrupt and oppressive as the lords they opposed. Money itself began to take new forms. Coins of silver and gold circulated widely, but inflation and debasement, reducing the amount of precious metal in coins, often destabilized economies. Kings, desperate for war funds, clipped coins or minted debased currency, cheating their people while enriching themselves. Trust in money wavered, and with it, trust in rulers. The Church officially condemning usury, the lending of money at interest, publicly scorned bankers. Yet behind closed doors, the Church itself borrowed heavily. Monasteries, bishops, even popes relied on loans from wealthy families like the Medici or the Fugger banking dynasty. Hypocrisy ran deep. Priests preached that money was sinful, yet the Church hoarded wealth, taxed the poor relentlessly, and sold indulgences, documents promising to shorten time in purgatory for cold, hard coin. Corruption spread into every corner of medieval life. Bribery was common in courts where justice often depended not on truth but on who could pay the judge. Lords extracted endless taxes and tolls from peasants, demanding coin for everything from using a mill to crossing a bridge. Soldiers poorly paid looted civilians. Officials skimmed money from church tithes. The entire system seemed designed not for fairness but for exploitation. And yet for some, trade offered a way out. A clever peasant who saved enough could move to a town, join a guild, and rise above the status of serf. Merchants became rich enough to rival knights, their children marrying into nobility. Towns like Venice, Genoa, and Bruges grew powerful, their wealth built not on land or titles but on trade and banking. For the first time, money challenged the old order of swords and crowns, but for most, money meant only new burdens. Coins were scarce in villages, so peasants often went into debt to pay taxes. Debt led to servitude, and families were trapped in cycles of poverty. A single bad harvest forced peasants to borrow grain or money from their lords, sinking them deeper into dependence. For a modern person, used to banks, credit cards, and stable currencies, the medieval economy would feel both primitive and predatory. Imagine being forced to pay fees for every basic necessity, while knowing that the wealth you handed over would be squandered on wars, palaces, or corrupt clergy. The rise of money and trade did not free the people of medieval Europe. It gave them new chains. And in a world where survival was already precarious, corruption only tightened the grip of power. Night in medieval Europe. For most people in the Middle Ages, nightfall was not a time of peace, it was a time of fear. When the sun disappeared and darkness crept across the land, the medieval world changed. Villages that had been noisy with work and markets fell silent. Streets emptied, doors were barred, and candles burned low inside smoky huts. Night meant danger, both real and imagined. Without street lamps or electricity, medieval towns plunged into near-total darkness once the sun set. Moonlight and torches offered the only light, and even those were scarce. Imagine walking through a medieval street at night. Narrow, uneven cobblestones underfoot, the stink of waste still clinging to the air, shadows stretching from tall wooden houses, every corner hiding something unknown. A single torch flickering on a wall might show you just enough to terrify you. Rats scurrying, stray dogs growling, or worse, the figure of a stranger. Most people avoided going out after dark unless absolutely necessary. Travelers caught on the roads risked being attacked by bandits, wolves, or worse. Towns often locked their gates at sunset, leaving latecomers stranded outside the walls. For peasants, the fields were filled with whispers of spirits and demons. Superstition reigned at night. People believed witches gathered in secret, casting curses under the moon. They believed the restless dead rose from their graves, wandering among the living. Even the hoot of an owl was considered an omen of death. But the dangers were not only supernatural. Human threats lurked everywhere. Drunken men stumbled out of taverns, fists ready to fight. Thieves prowled the alleys, cutting purses and breaking into homes. Prostitutes called from shadows, offering company at the risk of disease and scandal. For a woman walking alone, the night was especially perilous. Rape, robbery, or accusations of witchcraft could all end her life in ruin. Inside the home, night was hardly safer. Fire was a constant threat. Candles toppled easily. Thatched roofs caught quickly, and entire villages sometimes went up in flames while people slept. Families huddled together on straw beds, praying the night would pass without disaster. For nobles and castles, night meant its own kind of unease. Guards patrolled the walls, watching for enemy spies or sudden attacks. The silence of the countryside was broken only by the creak of wooden gates or the howl of wolves. Even within stone walls, lords and ladies feared betrayal, poison, or assassination while they slept. Sleep itself was different in the Middle Ages. Without artificial light, people often followed a segmented sleep pattern. They went to bed soon after sunset, slept for a few hours, then woke around midnight to pray, talk, or even visit neighbors before going back to sleep until dawn. In those waking hours, the boundary between dreams and reality blurred. People shared visions, omens, and fears of the night. Religious imagery haunted the darkness. Priests warned that demons prowled after sunset, seeking souls to drag to hell. Tales spread of succubi and incubi, spirits that attacked sleepers with lust and violence. Nightmares were seen not as random dreams, but as visits from evil forces. For villagers who already feared starvation and disease, the idea that the devil himself might come in the night was enough to keep them trembling until morning. And yet not all of the night was terror. In towns, festivals sometimes stretched past sunset, the glow of bonfires lighting up drunken songs and wild dances. Lovers met in secret beneath the cover of shadows. Storytellers wove tales by firelight, children listening wide-eyed before sleep. The night, though frightening, was also a place of mystery, intimacy, and imagination. For a modern person, stepping into a medieval night would be like walking into another world. No hum of electricity, no glow of lamps, no comfort of safety. Only the endless black, the sound of animals and whispers, the knowledge that danger, whether man, beast, or spirit, waited just beyond the edge of the fire's light. To survive the medieval night was to endure fear itself. Medieval medicine revisited. Plague doctors, superstitions, and the birth of hospitals. We've already seen how strange and dangerous medieval medicine could be, with its bloodletting, leeches, and endless obsession with the four humors. But the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. Medicine in the Middle Ages was as much about fear, faith, and ritual as it was about healing. And when Europe faced its greatest killer, the plague, medicine revealed both its limits and its dark creativity. The image most people know is the plague doctor, with his long black robes, wide-brimmed hat, and terrifying bird-like mask. To modern eyes, he looks like a villain from a nightmare. But in the 17th century, this costume was considered cutting-edge protection. The beaked mask was filled with herbs, spices, and vinegar-soaked cloth, believed to purify the foul air. Doctors thought disease spread through miasma, poisonous vapors in the atmosphere, so they stuffed their masks with rosemary, cloves, or camphor, hoping to filter death itself. Of course, the mask did little to stop fleas or bacteria, but it gave people the illusion of safety. Earlier, before the famous plague doctor costume existed, treatments were even stranger. Physicians advised carrying bouquets of flowers or burning sweet-smelling herbs in homes to drive away bad air. Others suggested drinking potions of crushed emeralds, ground bones, or even mercury. One cure recommended pressing a live chicken against the buboes until the bird itself grew sick, supposedly drawing the poison from the human body. Another prescribed bathing in one's own urine. Desperation made people try anything. But medieval medicine was not all superstition. Monasteries played an important role in preserving and expanding knowledge. Monks grew herb gardens, experimenting with remedies made from garlic, honey, willow bark, and sage. Some of these actually worked. Honey had antibacterial properties. Willow bark contained salicylic acid, a precursor to aspirin. Yet these small successes were buried under mountains of ineffective or dangerous treatments. Hospitals began to appear across Europe, though they were nothing like modern ones. Most were attached to monasteries and served not just the sick but the poor, travelers, and orphans. They were places of charity more than of medicine. Care meant a bed of straw, prayers from monks, and perhaps a simple broth. Surgery was rare and often deadly. An infected wound, a broken bone, or even a toothache could end your life. Surgeons who were considered lesser than physicians often doubled as barbers. Their skills included pulling teeth, setting bones, and amputating limbs, with no anesthesia beyond strong ale or opium if you were lucky. Patients bit down on leather straps, screamed in agony, and prayed to survive the saw's bite. Infection almost always followed, and many did not live long after treatment. Mental illness received even harsher responses. Epilepsy, melancholy, or hallucinations were seen as signs of demonic possession. Exorcisms were performed on the mentally ill, priests shouting prayers while families restrained their loved ones. Trepanning, the drilling of holes in the skull, was sometimes used to release evil spirits. Survival rates were abysmal. During the Black Death, the failure of medicine became undeniable. Physicians fled cities or died themselves. The few who stayed tried desperate measures, lancing buboes, bleeding victims, prescribing bizarre diets. Some recommended avoiding bathing, believing water opened the pores to disease. Others advised rubbing onions, arsenic, or even crushed snakes onto the skin. Nothing worked. Yet despite the chaos, the plague forced change. The sheer scale of death led to experiments in quarantine. Cities like Venice established plague houses and isolation zones, separating the sick from the healthy. Ships were held in harbor for 40 giorni, 40 days, the origin of the word quarantine. It was primitive, but it marked the beginning of public health. For a modern person, medieval medicine would be terrifying. Imagine falling ill and being treated with leeches, fire, or ground gemstones. Imagine walking into a hospital filled not with trained doctors, but with monks praying over rows of dying bodies. Imagine facing surgery without anesthesia, antiseptic, or any hope of recovery. In the Middle Ages, illness was not just a battle against disease. It was a battle against ignorance, superstition, and despair. Everyday work, guilds, craftsmen, and the rise of town life. When we think of medieval Europe, it's easy to imagine peasants in fields and nobles in castles. But another world existed between them, the growing life of towns. These towns were the beating heart of trade and craft, where cobblers, blacksmiths, weavers, and bakers worked from dawn to dusk. It was a life different from farming, but it was no less brutal, exhausting, and precarious. The backbone of town life was the guild. Guilds were associations of craftsmen who banded together to protect their trade. There were guilds for every profession: shoemakers, carpenters, masons, brewers, tailors. Each guild controlled prices, set standards of quality, and trained the next generation of workers. They were a mix of union, monopoly, and fraternity, giving towns both order and hierarchy. To enter a trade, a boy began as an apprentice, often as young as 12. He left his family to live with a master craftsman, working long hours for little or no pay. Apprentices slept in cramped workshops, fetched water, stoked fires, and endured endless scolding. If they survived years of training, they became journeymen, skilled workers who traveled from town to town selling their labor. Only a few eventually rose to the rank of master, allowed to open their own shop, display their own sign, and take apprentices of their own. But guild life was not only about work. Guilds were social and religious institutions too. They sponsored church altars, marched in processions, and held feasts for their members. At the same time, they defended their trade fiercely. Outsiders who tried to practice without permission could be fined, driven out, or worse. Competition was crushed and innovation often smothered under strict rules. For craftsmen, daily life was punishing. Blacksmiths toiled in sweltering forges, sparks flying, arms aching from hammering iron. Tanners worked in vats of rotting urine and animal hides, the stench unbearable. Weavers hunched over looms, eyes straining in dim light. Bakers rose long before dawn to knead dough in smoky, crowded ovens. Each trade carried its own dangers: burns, blindness, lung disease, crushed limbs. There were no safety regulations, no compensation for injury, no retirement. Merchants lived differently. Some became wealthy, importing spices, cloth, and exotic goods. Their houses were larger, their clothing finer, their influence greater, but they too lived with constant risk. A single shipwreck, a raid on a caravan, or a sudden change in law could ruin them overnight. Many merchants relied on loans, sinking into debt that chained them as tightly as any peasant tied to the land. Life in towns was noisy, crowded, and alive. Streets echoed with the hammering of smiths, the cries of vendors, the laughter of children darting between stalls. But beneath the bustle lay tension. Guilds fought over privileges. Merchants clashed with nobles who tried to tax them. Poor laborers, excluded from guilds, rioted when bread grew too expensive. Towns were centers of opportunity, but also of unrest. And yet towns offered something rare in the medieval world: the possibility of freedom. A peasant who escaped the manor and lived in a town for a year and a day without being caught could become free. Towns grew because they promised independence, however fragile. For many, that promise was worth the risk of disease, debt, and exploitation. Still, for a modern person, the work of medieval towns would be unbearable. Imagine the endless repetition of tasks, the lack of light, the constant injuries, and the air filled with smoke, stench, and dust. Imagine belonging to a guild that dictated every detail of your craft, from the tools you used to the price you charged. There was pride in being a craftsman, but freedom was always limited and survival was always uncertain. Medieval towns were not just places of trade. They were battlegrounds of labor, ambition, and survival. To walk their streets was to hear the heartbeat of a world changing slowly, painfully, and at great human cost. Crime in the shadows, outlaws, bandits, and pirates of the medieval world. Medieval Europe was a violent place, and not only on the battlefield. Away from the watchful eyes of kings and lords, crime thrived in the shadows. Roads were infested with bandits, forests hid dangerous outlaws, towns bred thieves and cut purses, and the seas were ruled by ruthless pirates. For ordinary people, crime was not an occasional threat. It was a daily reality lurking just beyond the edge of safety. Travel in particular was perilous. The open road between towns was a no-man's land, unguarded and wild. Merchants carrying goods risked ambush at any moment. Bandits hid in thickets and ravines, springing upon carts and travelers, robbing them of everything, sometimes leaving them beaten or dead on the roadside. Some bandits were desperate peasants driven by famine. Others were organized gangs, bold enough to challenge even armed escorts. Forests were especially feared. They were not the idyllic woodlands of fairy tales, but vast, dark labyrinths where law had little reach. Outlaws, criminals banished from towns, made their homes there, surviving on robbery, blackmail, and violence. Stories of legendary figures like Robin Hood softened the image of outlaws, but in truth most were brutal, preying on the weak. Travelers whispered prayers before entering woods, knowing they might not come out alive. Towns were no safer. Narrow alleys became hunting grounds for thieves. By day, cut purses worked markets, slipping knives through purses and pouches. By night, burglars crept through unlocked doors or climbed into windows, stealing food, money, or clothing. Violence was common. Drunken brawls in taverns, knives drawn over debts, prostitutes robbed or beaten by their clients. The poor stole from one another as often as from the rich, driven by hunger and desperation. The seas were perhaps the most dangerous of all. Pirates prowled the coasts of the North Sea, the Mediterranean, and beyond. They attacked merchant ships, looting cargo, enslaving sailors, and sinking vessels. Some pirates were little more than criminals, but others were funded by rival states, their raids blurring the line between piracy and war. Towns feared their sudden assaults. Entire villages sacked and burned by raiders from the sea. and justice did little to stop the tide of crime. Catching criminals was difficult, and punishments were brutal but often ineffective. Hanging thieves in public squares or leaving bandits to rot in gibbets served as warnings, but hunger and desperation kept others from stopping. Law enforcement was inconsistent. Many towns had night watchmen, but they were poorly armed and easily bribed. Lords might send soldiers to patrol roads, but their reach was limited, and often they themselves extorted travelers through tolls. Crime was not only about survival, it was about opportunity. Corruption ran deep. Officials took bribes to look the other way. Merchants fixed prices and cheated customers. Nobles themselves sometimes acted as little more than warlords, raiding villages and calling it tax collection. The line between authority and crime was blurred, leaving common people trapped in a world where the strong preyed on the weak. For a modern person, used to police courts and some guarantee of safety, medieval crime would be a shock. Imagine walking through a forest knowing armed men might descend on you at any moment. Imagine sailing a ship, only to see black sails on the horizon knowing you were about to be slaughtered or enslaved. Imagine stepping into a crowded market and clutching your purse, certain that dozens of hands were already reaching to steal it. Medieval Europe was a place where danger never slept. Whether on land, in towns, or at sea, crime was not an exception. It was part of the fabric of life. To survive, you needed luck, strength, or the favor of those in power. Without it, the shadows would swallow you whole. Fire, famine, and disaster, everyday catastrophes of medieval life. Life in medieval Europe was already brutal enough, but nature and chance added even greater horrors. For peasants and nobles alike, disaster was always close at hand. Fire, famine, and natural calamities could strike without warning, destroying entire communities in days. Survival was never guaranteed, and for many it was disaster, not war, that was the true enemy. Fire was one of the most dreaded threats, especially in towns. Houses were built of wood, thatched with straw and crammed tightly together. A single spark from a hearth could set an entire street ablaze. Candles toppled, cooking fires spread, and within minutes flames consumed everything. Towns had no organized fire brigades. Neighbors formed chains of buckets, passing water desperately, but their efforts were often hopeless. Once roofs caught, the fire leapt from house to house, reducing entire neighborhoods to ash. The stench of charred wood and flesh lingered long after the flames died. Survivors were left homeless, begging for shelter or rebuilding from nothing. If fire was sudden, famine was slow, creeping in like a shadow. Medieval Europe lived at the mercy of the harvest. One bad year could be endured. 2 bad years brought starvation. Crops failed from droughts, floods, or infestations of locusts. Grain rotted in damp fields. When harvests failed, bread grew scarce, prices soared, and the poor starved first. Families stretched meager supplies by mixing bark or sawdust into bread, boiling weeds into thin soups. Hunger swelled bellies, weakened bodies, and invited disease. Children died in droves, and even the strong grew frail. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was one of the worst. Relentless rains drowned fields, turning crops to mud. Livestock perished, unable to graze. Entire regions starved. Chroniclers wrote of desperate men and women digging up corpses to eat, of parents abandoning children, of villages left empty. It was a disaster as devastating as any war, and it left scars for generations. Natural disasters added more terror. Floods swept through river valleys, drowning homes and washing away fields. Storms sank ships, taking merchants and fishermen to watery graves. In mountainous regions, avalanches and landslides buried travelers alive. Even earthquakes, though rare, could topple churches and castles, convincing survivors that God himself was striking in anger. Plagues of locusts, infestations of rats, and outbreaks of livestock disease struck like curses. A single epidemic among sheep could wipe out the wool trade for years, plunging towns into poverty. When horses died, plowing ceased, and entire villages faced hunger. People saw these disasters as divine punishment, turning to prayer, fasting, and flagellation. Yet no amount of penance could protect them from the cruelty of nature. For peasants, disaster meant ruin. They had no reserves, no savings. When crops failed, they starved. When fires burned, they lost everything. For nobles, disaster was different but no less severe. Castles could be besieged by famine just as surely as by armies, and fire consumed stone halls as easily as wooden huts. For a modern person, the fragility of medieval life would be incomprehensible. Today, food comes from supermarkets. Fire brigades protect cities, and technology predicts storms. But in the Middle Ages, a single summer of bad weather could kill millions. Imagine knowing that one cold rain, one spark, one swarm of insects could erase your world. That was the reality for every man, woman, and child in medieval Europe. To live always on the edge of catastrophe. Justice and fear, the Inquisition and witch hunts. If medieval justice was already brutal, the rise of the Inquisition and the fear of witchcraft took it to a darker level. The Middle Ages were an age of faith, but faith was twisted into a weapon. Suspicion, fear, and paranoia became tools of control, and countless innocent lives were destroyed in the name of God and law. The Inquisition began in the 12th century, when the Church sought to root out heresy, beliefs that deviated from official doctrine. Heretics were not just seen as mistaken, but as dangerous threats to the entire Christian order. If one person doubted, the fear was that whole communities might follow. And so the Inquisition was born, a system of secretive trials, harsh interrogations, and merciless punishment. Inquisitors traveled from town to town, setting up courts where anyone could be accused. Neighbors denounced neighbors, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of envy or revenge. The accused were dragged before clerics, questioned endlessly, and pressured to confess. The burden of proof was nearly impossible. Silence was guilt, denial was guilt, and confession under torture was guilt confirmed. Torture was central. The rack stretched bodies until joints snapped. The strapado wrenched arms from sockets. Hot irons burned flesh. Thumbscrews crushed bones. Victims screamed, begged, confessed to anything to end the pain. Once a confession was given, even if it was false, the process was complete. Punishment followed, whippings, prison, or more often, death. Heretics were not alone. The growing fear of witches cast an even wider net. Although the peak of the witch hunts came later, in the early modern period the seeds were planted in the Middle Ages. Women, especially poor, old, or eccentric, were accused of making pacts with the devil, of flying through the night, of poisoning crops and livestock. A failed harvest, blame the witch. A sick child, blame the witch. A cow that stopped giving milk, blame the witch. The trials were cruel. Suspected witches were subjected to ordeals. One common method was the swimming test. The accused was bound and thrown into water. If she floated, it was proof that she rejected baptism and thus was guilty. If she sank, she was innocent, but often drowned before she could be rescued. Another test involved searching for the witch's mark, a spot on the body insensitive to pain, said to be where the devil had kissed her. Of course, the mark could be anything: birthmarks, scars, even freckles. Confessions were often extracted by torture, and once again the accused would say anything to stop the agony. Some women confessed to meeting demons in the woods, to flying through the air on broomsticks, to causing storms or plagues. Whether they believed it or not, their words sealed their fate. Execution usually followed, most often by fire. Public burnings drew huge crowds. Priests preached while flames consumed the condemned. The screams of the accused mingled with the prayers of the crowd. The fear was not limited to women. Men too were accused: healers, midwives, or anyone whose knowledge seemed suspicious. The line between folk medicine and witchcraft blurred. Those who practiced herbal cures could be celebrated one day and condemned the next. The Inquisition and witch hunts thrived because they served the powerful. They silenced dissent, reinforced the Church's authority, and gave communities a way to explain disasters they could not understand. Instead of confronting famine, disease, or corruption, people blamed witches and heretics. Fear became control. For a modern person, the idea of being condemned for your beliefs or for simply being different would be chilling. Imagine being dragged from your home, accused by jealous neighbors, tortured until you confessed to crimes you never committed, and burned alive while a crowd cheered. That was justice in much of medieval Europe. Not truth, but terror. Travel and pilgrimage. Roads of faith and peril. In medieval Europe, most people lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace. Villages were isolated, towns were small, and the roads between them were rough, dangerous, and poorly maintained. Yet despite the risks, travel was not uncommon. Merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, and adventurers all set out onto Europe's roads. For some, travel was a necessity. For others, it was a holy duty. For nearly everyone, it was a gamble with death. The roads themselves were treacherous. Forget smooth highways. Most medieval roads were little more than dirt paths carved by centuries of feet, hooves, and wagon wheels. Rain turned them to mud, drought turned them to dust. Bridges were rare, and rivers had to be forded. Travelers risked being swept away by currents, their carts and goods lost in an instant. Mountains brought narrow passes where a single slip meant death, while forests swallowed travelers whole, leaving them to wander until exhaustion claimed them. Bandits haunted these roads. Every traveler knew the fear of ambush, figures emerging from the trees with clubs, knives, or bows, demanding coin or blood. Merchants often traveled in caravans for protection, while pilgrims banded together in groups hoping that numbers would deter attack. Sometimes they succeeded. Other times the bandits struck anyway, leaving corpses as grim reminders of the danger. Yet, despite these risks, pilgrimage became one of the most common reasons for long journeys. The Church encouraged the faithful to travel to holy sites, promising blessings, forgiveness of sins, or even healing. Pilgrims walked hundreds of miles to reach destinations like Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, or Rome itself. The most devoted and the wealthiest set their sights on Jerusalem, though reaching it meant crossing continents and surviving deserts, crusades, and hostile lands. Pilgrimage was not a leisurely walk. Pilgrims trudged in rough shoes, their feet blistered, their clothes ragged. They slept in barns, inns, or under the stars. Food was scarce and often spoiled, water dangerous to drink. Many pilgrims never returned, dying on the road from illness, exhaustion, or violence. And yet the roads teemed with them, chanting prayers, carrying staffs and badges that marked their destination. For merchants, travel meant trade and danger meant profit. The wool merchants of England, the spice traders of Venice, the Hanseatic League of Northern Europe, all risked their lives to move goods across long, perilous routes. Ships carried cargoes across seas plagued by pirates and storms, while caravans wound through territories where local lords demanded tolls at every bridge and gate. Each journey was a gamble. A ship might bring riches or sink with everything aboard. Knights and soldiers traveled too, marching to wars or crusades. Their journeys often devastated the lands they passed through. Armies lived off the countryside, stripping villages bare, stealing food, burning homes. For peasants, the sight of soldiers on the road was as frightening as the sight of bandits. Even ordinary travelers faced suspicion. Strangers were rarely welcomed. A lone wanderer entering a village might be seen as a beggar, a thief, or a spy. Hospitality existed, but trust was scarce. To be far from home was to be vulnerable, both to the dangers of the road and to the hostility of those you met. And yet travel also brought stories, knowledge, and connection. Pilgrims returned with tales of faraway shrines. Merchants brought news of distant lands, and minstrels spread songs and legends from one town to the next. Travel knit medieval Europe together, slowly, painfully, through paths soaked in blood and prayers. For a modern person used to cars, trains, and planes, the medieval road would be a nightmare. Imagine walking for weeks with no guarantee of food or safety, never knowing if the next bend held a village, a bandit, or a wolf. Imagine crossing mountains with nothing but worn boots, sleeping in the mud, your fate resting in the hands of strangers. In medieval Europe, the road was not freedom. It was peril dressed as faith. Festivals of death, dancing with mortality in medieval Europe. For people in medieval Europe, death was everywhere. It lingered in the fields where famine claimed the hungry, in the towns where plague cut down families, and on the roads where bandits and soldiers left corpses to rot. Yet in the face of so much death, people did something that might seem shocking to us today. They celebrated it. They wove death into their songs, their dances, and their festivals. To live in the shadow of mortality was not only to fear it, but to embrace it. One of the most haunting expressions of this was the dance of death, the danse macabre. Appearing in paintings, plays, and poems, it depicted skeletons leading people of every rank, peasants, priests, kings, even popes, into a grim procession. The message was clear: death spared no one. It was the great equalizer. A king and a beggar might live different lives, but in the grave they were the same. These images adorned church walls, reminding worshippers at every mass that their time was short. Festivals, too, reflected this obsession. During carnivals and feast days, people donned masks of skulls and demons, mocking death as they danced through the streets. It was a strange mixture of joy and terror, laughter echoing beneath grim visages as though by mocking death they could rob it of its power. The Feast of Fools was one such carnival, when the world turned upside down. Priests dressed as jesters, peasants mocked their lords, and sacred rituals were twisted into bawdy parodies. For a few days, death, sin, and fear were ridiculed openly until order returned. But behind the laughter was a darker truth. These festivals were not simply entertainment, they were an escape, a way of coping with a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed. Even funerals carried elements of spectacle. Processions wound through streets with chanting, incense, and music. In some regions, professional mourners were hired to weep and wail, turning grief into ritualized performance. In others, wakes became feasts, where families drank and sang beside the body of the deceased, blurring the line between mourning and celebration. The obsession with death seeped into popular entertainment as well. Mystery plays staged by guilds often dramatized scenes of hell, filled with devils dragging souls into flames. Audiences laughed at the grotesque demons, but they also trembled, reminded of what awaited the sinful. Death was never far, even in laughter. For children, toys of skulls and skeletons were not uncommon, teaching them from an early age to remember mortality. Poems and prayers drilled the lesson home. Life was short, eternity was long, and every breath might be your last. Even lullabies sometimes carried grim undertones, whispering reminders that death might come in the night. This constant confrontation with death created a strange familiarity. People did not hide death as we do today. They lived with it openly. Cemeteries were in the heart of towns, bones stacked in ossuaries, skulls staring from beneath church floors. Children played beside graves, lovers met among tombstones, families picnicked in the shadow of crypts. Death was not separate from life, it was its twin companion. For a modern person, the idea of celebrating death would be disturbing, even grotesque. Imagine a festival where people paraded with skeleton masks mocking their own mortality. Imagine walking into a church where the walls showed skeletons dragging popes and emperors into the grave. Imagine children laughing and dancing beside skulls. Yet for the people of medieval Europe, this was normal. To them, death was not something to hide or deny. It was a constant truth, and to face it with laughter was perhaps the only victory they could hope for. In the end, these festivals of death were not signs of despair but of resilience. By laughing at death, mocking it, and weaving it into every song and dance, medieval people found a way to live in its shadow. They knew they would not last long in this world, but while they did, they would dance with death as their partner. The world of the monastery. Silence, prayer, and hidden power. In the imagination of medieval Europe, monasteries were sanctuaries of holiness, places where men and women withdrew from the world to serve God in silence, prayer, and humility. But behind their stone walls, monasteries were not only centers of faith, they were centers of power, knowledge, and sometimes corruption. To step into a monastery was to enter another world, one that was both sacred and deeply human. Monks lived under strict rules. The most famous was the rule of Saint Benedict, which demanded obedience, poverty, and chastity. Monastic life followed a relentless rhythm of prayer, work, and study. Bells rang through the day and night, summoning monks to chant the divine office, psalms and hymns that divided the hours. Even at midnight, the call to prayer woke the community, voices echoing in cold stone chapels while candles flickered against the dark. Sleep was short, meals were plain, and every day was a cycle of devotion and labor. Work in monasteries was varied. Some monks tilled fields, tended vineyards, or brewed ale. Others copied manuscripts by hand, preserving ancient texts in painstaking script. In an age when most of Europe was illiterate, monasteries became guardians of knowledge, their libraries storing wisdom that might otherwise have been lost. Illuminated manuscripts adorned with gold and intricate art were treasures created by quiet, patient hands in dimly lit scriptoria. Monasteries also provided medicine. Monks grew herb gardens and treated the sick with remedies that mixed faith and folk healing. Their infirmaries cared for travelers and peasants, offering shelter and soup along with prayers. Hospitals as we know them today grew out of these monastic traditions, where care for the body was inseparable from care for the soul. But monasteries were not only about piety, they were also about wealth. Over time, many monasteries grew rich from land donations, tithes, and rents. They became landlords, overseeing villages and peasants just like secular lords. Some abbots lived almost like princes, with feasts, fine clothes, and political influence. The church preached poverty, yet monasteries often overflowed with gold, silver, and luxury goods. This contradiction did not go unnoticed, and it fueled resentment among the poor who saw monks living far better than they did. Nunneries offered women a rare alternative to marriage. For noble daughters, becoming a nun could mean avoiding an unwanted union and gaining a measure of autonomy. Some convents produced brilliant writers and thinkers, women who corresponded with kings and popes. But convent life was still strict, with vows of chastity and obedience, and not all women entered by choice. Many were sent against their will, their families deciding their fates. Monasteries also wielded hidden power. They were deeply tied to politics, often serving as advisors to kings or as centers of diplomacy. Their lands made them wealthy, and their spiritual authority made them influential. When conflict arose, abbots and bishops could tip the balance with their words or with the armies funded by their estates. Far from being isolated, monasteries were woven into the fabric of medieval power. For ordinary people, monasteries were both admired and feared. They were seen as holy places, yet also as distant and mysterious. Monks and nuns seemed set apart, their lives strange to peasants who labored in the fields. And yet, when famine struck or plague spread, villagers looked to monasteries for aid, prayers, and hope. For a modern person, stepping into a medieval monastery would feel both alien and familiar. The silence, the chanting, the strict routine, all would seem suffocating. Yet the libraries, the gardens, the sense of discipline would feel strangely advanced, a glimpse of order in a chaotic world. Monasteries were not simply places of prayer, they were engines of survival, shaping the culture, politics, and even the future of Europe. The market of souls, indulgences, relics, and the selling of salvation. For people in medieval Europe, faith was not just belief, it was survival. The church promised that obedience, prayer, and charity could secure your place in heaven. But when death was everywhere, plague, famine, war, the fear of eternal damnation was unbearable. And so salvation itself became a commodity. Forgiveness could be bought, grace could be sold, and the souls of men and women became currency in the vast spiritual marketplace of the Middle Ages. The most infamous form of this was the indulgence. Officially, indulgences were meant to reduce the time a soul spent in purgatory, the painful cleansing fire between earth and heaven. A priest might grant one for acts of devotion, pilgrimages, or service to the poor, but over time, indulgences became a thriving trade. Instead of fasting or walking to a shrine, you could simply pay a fee. The church claimed that with a few coins, you could save years or even centuries of suffering after death. For peasants, this meant selling a cow or their meager harvest to buy peace for themselves or their dead relatives. For the church, it meant endless rivers of gold. Relics were another powerful business. Across Europe, churches boasted sacred objects: the bones of saints, splinters of the true cross, drops of Christ's blood, or feathers from angels' wings. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles to touch or see these relics, believing they carried miraculous power. The more famous the relic, the greater the crowds and the greater the donations. Entire towns prospered if they possessed a popular relic. Pilgrimage sites became medieval tourist destinations, fueled by fear of hell and hope for salvation. But the relic trade was rife with fraud. There were so many supposed fragments of the true cross that, as critics joked, one could build an entire ship from them. Multiple churches claimed to have the same saint's skull or the same holy garment. Yet the faithful came anyway, dropping coins into church coffers desperate for blessings. Truth mattered less than belief. This spiritual economy extended into every corner of life. The poor were told to tithe, giving 1/10 of their income to the church. The wealthy could found monasteries or chapels to buy eternal prayers for their souls. Entire masses could be purchased to speed a loved one through purgatory. Nobles who died in battle against non-Christians were promised martyrdom, their sins washed away in blood. Even violence became currency for salvation. Corruption flourished. Bishops and abbots grew rich, their cathedrals adorned with gold while peasants starved. Pardoners roamed the countryside selling indulgences, some inventing sins and punishments to frighten villagers into paying. Satirists of the time mocked these practices, but few dared challenge them openly. To question the sale of salvation was to risk being branded a heretic. And yet for ordinary people, these transactions offered comfort. Imagine a peasant mother who lost her child to plague. The thought of her child suffering in purgatory was unbearable. But a coin placed on the altar, a relic kissed, an indulgence purchased, these were tangible acts of love, ways to ease the unbearable. The system may have been corrupt, but it fed on real grief and fear. For a modern person, the idea of paying money for forgiveness may seem absurd, even offensive. But in a world where death was constant and hell was certain, people grasped for anything that promised hope. If a coin could buy peace for your soul or for your child's, wouldn't you pay it? That was the cruel genius of the medieval church. It sold not just relics or indulgences, it sold the most valuable thing of all, salvation itself. The hidden nightlife of the Middle Ages, taverns, brothels, and forbidden pleasures by day, medieval Europe was a world of toil, prayer, and fear. But when the sun sank and shadows covered the towns, another life stirred, a world of taverns, brothels, and forbidden pleasures. It was a side of medieval life rarely shown in illuminated manuscripts, but it existed in every town, thriving in the cracks of poverty, desire, and survival. Taverns were the heart of nightlife. Crude wooden buildings filled with smoke and laughter. They were gathering places for peasants, merchants, and sometimes even knights. The smell of stale ale, sweat, and roasting meat hit you the moment you entered. Benches and tables were sticky with spilled drink. Dogs fought underfoot for scraps, and the air vibrated with shouting voices. People drank heavily, ale for the poor, wine for the rich, and drunkenness was not an accident but an expectation. Alcohol was the escape of the masses. Weak ale was safer than water, but taverns also sold strong brews that sent tempers flaring. Brawls were common. A careless word, a cheated dice game, or a wandering hand could spark fists, knives, or even bloodshed. To the medieval mind, violence was part of the fun. Tavern owners tolerated it because fights meant more drinking, and more drinking meant more profit. Dice games, cards, and other forms of gambling filled the tables. Coins clinked, fortunes were won and lost in a single night, and cheating was rampant. Accusations flew, fists slammed, and losers often staggered home penniless, or didn't make it home at all. Gambling was condemned by the church, but it thrived anyway, feeding both hope and despair. But taverns were not just for drinking and gambling, they were also social centers. Travelers brought news and stories from distant lands. Minstrels performed songs of knights, battles, and bawdy love. Storytellers wove tales that made peasants forget their misery for a few hours. For women, taverns were both opportunity and danger. Some served as barmaids, while others worked as prostitutes under the same roof. Which leads us to brothels. Despite strict religious codes, prostitution was widespread and often tolerated by authorities as a necessary evil. Brothels ranged from filthy shacks and back alleys to organized houses near city gates. Women, many of them poor or abandoned, sold their bodies to survive. Some were coerced or enslaved. Others chose it as the only way to earn money in a world that gave women few choices. The conditions were grim. Disease spread easily. Syphilis and other infections ruined lives. Prostitutes were shamed, denied respect, and often subjected to violence. And yet they were in constant demand. Soldiers, merchants, and even clergy visited brothels. Despite the church's endless sermons against lust, it was an open secret. What was condemned from the pulpit thrived in the shadows. Beyond taverns and brothels, nightlife offered other forbidden pleasures. Secret gatherings for gambling, drinking, and even occult rituals whispered through towns. Some sought fortune tellers who read the future in cards or bones. Others experimented with alchemy or forbidden texts, seeking knowledge banned by the church. Night was the time when rules loosened, when the veil of respectability dropped, and when hidden desires emerged. The church tried to control it all. Priests preached against drunkenness, gambling, and lust, warning of hellfire. Authorities regulated brothels, taxed them, and sometimes even designated red light districts. But the reality was clear. The more people suffered by day, the more they craved release by night. And so the tavern doors stayed open, the dice kept rolling, and the brothels never emptied. For a modern person, the nightlife of medieval Europe would be shocking. Imagine taverns without music systems, only the roar of voices and the clash of mugs. Imagine brothels where disease and poverty festered, yet business thrived. Imagine a world where vice was not hidden but woven into everyday life. The night offered no neon lights, no safety, only raw human hunger in its purest form. The hidden nightlife of the Middle Ages was not about joy. It was about survival, escape, and the fleeting illusion of freedom. When dawn came, debts remained, diseases spread, and guilt weighed heavy. But for a few hours each night, peasants, merchants, and even lords could forget the misery of the day and surrender to forbidden pleasures in the shadows. The children's world, games, superstitions, and harsh realities childhood in medieval Europe was nothing like the one we imagine today. There were no school playgrounds filled with laughter, no colorful toys lining shelves, no long years of carefree innocence. To be a child in the Middle Ages was to be caught between two worlds, play and superstition, laughter and labor, fragile joy and overwhelming danger. From the moment they could walk, children were expected to work. In villages, boys chased geese, carried water, gathered firewood, and herded animals. Girls learned to spin wool, weave cloth, and help prepare meals. Childhood was short. By the age of 7, many children were already seen not as children but as small adults. They worked in the fields, followed their fathers into workshops, or carried baskets of goods to market. By 12, some were married, yet children did play. They made toys from what they had, dolls carved from wood, animals made of clay, hoops and balls fashioned from scraps of leather. They played games of tag and wrestling, and in towns they imitated adults with mock sword fights or miniature market stalls. Festivals brought parades, jugglers, and puppet shows that filled their eyes with wonder. For a few hours, children could forget hunger and fear. Superstition shaped childhood as much as labor. Parents feared spirits and witches that might steal or curse their children. Amulets were hung around infants' necks, charms whispered over cradles, prayers muttered against the evil eye. Sickness was often blamed on curses, and mothers burned herbs or sprinkled holy water to protect their young. Even lullabies carried grim warnings, reminders that death could come in the night. Education was rare and divided sharply by class. Noble boys were sent to monasteries or trained as pages in castles, learning Latin, swordsmanship, and the art of war. Noble girls learned music, embroidery, and manners to prepare them for marriage. For peasant children, literacy was almost unheard of. Their lessons came in the form of chores, traditions, and the survival skills their parents passed down. To read and write was a privilege beyond reach for most. The dangers of childhood were immense. Disease claimed half of all children before the age of 5. Accidents were common: drownings in rivers, burns from open fires, falls from roofs or carts. Hunger weakened young bodies, making them prey to fevers and infections. Many mothers had multiple children, knowing only a few would survive into adulthood. But despite the dangers, children were cherished. Parents grieved deeply when they lost them, even if death was common. Medieval songs and writings reveal raw sorrow for lost children, proof that love was no weaker then than it is now. Families clung to joy where they could, celebrating births, baptisms, and small victories of survival. For a modern person, medieval childhood would be a shock. Imagine a 6-year-old carrying heavy buckets of water, a 10-year-old tending livestock alone in the fields, a 12-year-old married and bearing children. Imagine growing up surrounded by death, yet still finding moments to laugh and play in the mud with handmade toys. Childhood in the Middle Ages was fragile, fleeting, and often cut short, but it was also resilient, full of small sparks of joy in a dark and dangerous world. The world of work and punishment for children, apprenticeships, beatings, and early responsibility. In the Middle Ages, childhood ended almost as soon as it began. By modern standards, children were thrust into adult responsibilities shockingly early. Work, discipline, and obedience defined their world, and punishment was harsh for those who failed to meet expectations. To be a child was not to be sheltered. It was to be molded, often painfully, into a servant of family, community, and faith. At the heart of this process was apprenticeship. For boys, this was the bridge between childhood and adulthood. Around the age of 12, sometimes even younger, they were sent away from home to live with a master craftsman. For 7 years or more, they worked long days in workshops, not for wages, but for food, shelter, and training. Apprentices swept floors, hauled water, stoked fires, and fetched tools before they were ever allowed to practice the craft. They were beaten for mistakes, scolded for laziness, and pushed to their limits. Only after years of grueling labor might they become journeymen, free to travel and earn wages. Girls rarely became apprentices, but their training was no less demanding. From an early age, they were taught to spin, weave, cook, and manage households. Noble daughters learned courtly manners, music, and embroidery, but even they carried immense responsibilities, preparing to marry into alliances that shaped entire regions. For peasant girls, the burden was heavier still. By 12 or 13, many were mothers themselves, responsible for children before they were fully grown. Discipline was central to medieval childhood, and it was enforced with severity. Beatings were not only common, they were considered necessary. The saying, "spare the rod, spoil the child," was taken literally. Parents, teachers, and masters all believed physical punishment was essential to drive out laziness and sin. Children were whipped with rods, struck with hands, or forced into painful positions as punishment. Bruises and tears were part of daily life. Even schools where they existed were places of harsh discipline. Students who misbehaved or failed to memorize lessons were flogged. Education was less about curiosity and more about obedience, drilling Latin prayers and moral lessons through fear. To question or argue was unthinkable. Knowledge was delivered with the whip as much as with the book. Religion reinforced this discipline. Children were taught that disobedience was not only a sin against parents but against God himself. Stories of hellfire and demons were used to frighten them into submission. Priests warned that lazy children, liars, or thieves might find themselves damned for eternity. Even play was sometimes condemned, seen as a waste of time that distracted from prayer or work. But responsibility did not stop at work and prayer. It extended to survival itself. Children were expected to contribute to the family economy, whether by tending animals, helping in markets, or spinning wool late into the night. A child who could not work was often seen as a burden. Hunger left no room for leniency, and yet, despite the harshness, bonds of love remained. Parents cherished obedient children, praised them in songs and stories, and celebrated milestones like baptisms or marriages. Apprentices who succeeded sometimes looked back with pride at the hardships that had shaped them. But for many, the scars, physical and emotional, lasted a lifetime. For a modern person, medieval childhood would feel like imprisonment. Imagine being 12 years old and already bound to a master who could beat you, starve you, or work you from dawn to dusk. Imagine living in constant fear of punishment, knowing that even a small mistake could bring the rod across your back. Imagine carrying adult burdens before you had even left childhood behind. In the Middle Ages, children were not shielded from the world. They were thrown into its harshest realities, expected to endure or perish. The medieval village, community, gossip, and survival together. If the castle was the symbol of power in the Middle Ages, the village was the heart of survival. The vast majority of people in Europe lived not in towns or cities, but in tiny rural communities, often no more than a cluster of wooden huts, a church, and fields stretching to the horizon. To live in a medieval village was to live in a world where everyone knew you, where your life was bound to your neighbors, and where gossip could be as dangerous as famine. A typical village might hold 100 to 300 people, families crowded into one-room huts with walls of wattle and daub, thatched roofs and dirt floors. Inside, the air was smoky from the hearth. Animals sometimes shared the living space, and privacy was non-existent. Chickens fluttered under benches, pigs rooted in corners, and children played in the straw. Life was noisy, cramped, and filled with the smell of smoke, sweat, and manure. Daily life revolved around the commons, the fields, meadows, and pastures shared by the entire village. Each family had strips of land to farm, but everyone relied on one another for plowing, harvests, and survival. Cooperation was essential. If one family's harvest failed, others might help. If the village as a whole suffered, famine followed. Mutual aid bound people together, but so did mutual suspicion. Gossip was the lifeblood of the medieval village. With little entertainment and constant hardship, neighbors watched one another closely. Who stole wood from the forest? Who skipped mass? Who had too much bread when others starved? Whispers could ruin reputations, spark feuds, or even lead to accusations of witchcraft. To be different was dangerous. Women who knew too much about herbs, men who kept to themselves, or families who prospered too visibly might find themselves targets of envy and suspicion. The church was the center of village life. The bell marked the hours, mass brought people together, and priests mediated disputes. But the church was also a reminder of fear. Sermons thundered about sin, hell, and damnation. The churchyard doubled as a cemetery, its graves visible to everyone, a daily reminder of mortality. Children played among the tombstones while adults prayed for their souls beside them. Work in the village never ended. Men labored in the fields, plowing and planting, while women spun wool, baked bread, and tended gardens. Children carried water, gathered firewood, and herded animals. Seasons dictated everything: spring planting, summer tending, autumn harvest, winter hunger. A single bad season could break the village. Festivals were the rare moments of relief. Feasts for saints' days brought music, dancing, and ale. Weddings turned into communal celebrations, with entire villages drinking and singing late into the night. But joy was always fleeting. Winter came quickly, stores ran low, and hunger returned. Justice in villages was often rough and personal. Petty disputes over land, livestock, or insults sometimes erupted into fights. Local courts dealt punishments that ranged from fines to humiliating stocks. For serious crimes, villagers were marched to nearby towns for harsher justice. But most disputes were settled through community pressure. If everyone turned against you, life became unbearable. For a modern person, the lack of privacy would be shocking. Imagine a world where every neighbor knew your business, where your survival depended on cooperation, but your reputation could collapse overnight. Imagine living your entire life in a handful of acres, never traveling more than a few miles from your birthplace. The medieval village was not just a place, it was a prison of necessity, built on labor, gossip, faith, and fear. And yet villages endured. Despite hardship, people laughed together, told stories by the fire, and leaned on one another in times of crisis. Community was suffocating, but it was also the only thing standing between survival and ruin. The medieval city, crowds, chaos, and opportunity. If the medieval village was small, insular, and bound by tradition, the medieval city was its opposite, crowded, chaotic, and bursting with opportunity as well as danger. Cities were magnets for trade, wealth, and power, but they were also cesspools of filth, crime, and disease. To step into a medieval city was to step into a world that dazzled and repelled in equal measure. At first sight, the city impressed. Walls of stone towered high, bristling with watchtowers and gates. Approaching from the countryside, you might see spires piercing the sky, banners fluttering, and the great bulk of a cathedral rising above the rooftops. The noise reached your ears before you entered, merchants shouting, carts rattling, bells tolling. For peasants who had never seen more than their village, the city seemed like another universe. But inside the gates, reality struck. Streets were narrow and twisting, packed with people. Horses, carts, pigs, and dogs clogged the paths. Waste was dumped into open gutters flowing down the middle of the road. The stench was overpowering, a choking mixture of smoke, manure, and rotting food. Rats scurried underfoot, spreading fleas and disease. There was no clean water, and every sip from a well carried risk. Houses leaned dangerously over the streets, built taller with each generation until they nearly touched at the top. Families crowded into small, dark rooms, entire households crammed into single spaces. Privacy was a fantasy. Noise never ceased, vendors, beggars, church bells, and the constant rumble of humanity. For some, the chaos was thrilling. For others, it was suffocating. Yet cities also offered opportunity. Guilds flourished here, giving craftsmen and merchants a chance to prosper. Markets bustled with goods from across the world, silks from the East, spices from India, wool from England, and wine from France. Apprentices arrived to learn trades, journeymen to find work, and ambitious peasants to escape the bondage of the land. The city was a ladder, and though most remained at the bottom, a few climbed high. Cathedrals dominated the skyline, their vast stone bodies consuming centuries of labor. They were more than churches. They were symbols of power, wealth, and faith. Inside, stained glass bathed the faithful in holy light, while outside, gargoyles leered from above, grim reminders of sin. Pilgrims flocked to relics kept within, pouring coins into the city's coffers. The cathedral was the beating heart of the medieval city, both a place of worship and a monument to human ambition. But the city was also dangerous. Crime lurked in every alley. Thieves cut purses in crowded markets. Gangs fought in backstreets, and murders were not uncommon. The poor begged for scraps while prostitutes called from shadowy doorways. Night was especially perilous. Without lights, the city became a labyrinth of darkness where criminals prowled freely. Fires were a constant threat. Wooden houses packed tightly together went up in flames with terrifying speed. Entire districts burned in hours, leaving thousands homeless. Disease struck even more often. Smallpox, typhus, and above all the plague turned cities into death traps. With people packed shoulder to shoulder, infection spread like wildfire. Bells tolled endlessly as carts carried bodies to overcrowded cemeteries. Still, people came. Despite the filth, the danger, and the fear, cities drew dreamers, rebels, and the desperate. They offered what villages could not: choice. A runaway serf who lived in a city for a year and a day could gain freedom. A clever merchant could become wealthy. A skilled craftsman could rise in a guild. For women, opportunities were rare but possible, selling goods, brewing ale, or even running taverns. For a modern person, the medieval city would be overwhelming. Imagine walking streets where sewage flowed openly, where rats brushed your legs, where every cough might carry death. Imagine trying to sleep as bells clanged, drunks shouted, and dogs howled through the night. Imagine being both dazzled by towering cathedrals and horrified by corpses rotting in the gutters. The medieval city was a paradox, a place of hope and horror, opportunity and despair. And yet these cities shaped the future. They birthed universities, fueled trade, and created new classes of people who were neither peasants nor nobles. They were crucibles of change forged in chaos. To live in a medieval city was to gamble daily with your life. But for many, it was a gamble worth taking. War of Faith, the daily life of a Crusader knight. The Crusades are often remembered in sweeping terms. Great armies marching across continents, epic battles for cities like Antioch or Jerusalem. But behind the grand campaigns was the daily reality of a Crusader's life, and it was far from glorious. For knights and soldiers, every day was a trial of faith, endurance, and survival in a land that was as hostile as the enemy itself. The journey east began with hardship. Knights left behind estates, families, and comfort. Setting out on months-long marches through unfamiliar lands, they traveled in heat and dust through mountains and deserts, across rivers and plains. Their armor weighed heavily on their shoulders, their horses weakened with every mile, and food grew scarce quickly. Even before battle, many Crusaders collapsed from hunger and thirst, their bones left to bleach along the road. Camp life was a world of its own. By day, knights drilled with swords and lances, preparing for battles that might come at any moment. By night, they huddled under makeshift tents, surrounded by the stench of sweat, manure, and unwashed bodies. Disease ran rampant in the camps. Dysentery, fevers, and infections killed more men than arrows or swords. Corpses piled near camp edges, shallow graves barely covering the dead before dogs and vultures dug them up again. Food was always uncertain. Bread grew moldy, meat spoiled in the heat, and water was often foul. Crusaders resorted to eating roots, leather, or whatever animals they could catch. Chronicles speak of famine so severe that men boiled horse bones for broth. At the siege of Antioch, starvation drove Crusaders to dig up corpses, their desperation turning them into cannibals. Faith may have carried them forward, but hunger hollowed them into shadows of men. When battle finally came, it was chaos. The heat of the Levant was suffocating, the sun glaring off steel. Knights charged on horseback, lances shattering against shields. Foot soldiers clashed in dust and blood, screams filling the air. Arrows darkened the sky, cutting men down in droves. Horses panicked, trampling friend and foe alike. For hours, the battlefield was nothing but madness, dust, steel, and death. But battle was not only about swords. Sieges dominated Crusader warfare. To storm fortified cities, Crusaders built towers, battering rams, and catapults. They hurled stones, fire, and even diseased corpses over walls. Inside the city, defenders starved, while outside, attackers suffered from heat, thirst, and arrows raining from above. When cities finally fell, the slaughter was merciless. Entire populations, men, women, and children, were massacred, the streets running red as Crusaders claimed victory in the name of God. Faith was both the Crusader's strength and his burden. Priests marched with the armies, preaching sermons, holding mass, and urging men to believe that every hardship brought them closer to salvation. Relics were carried into battle, splinters of the true cross, bones of saints meant to guarantee God's favor. And yet doubts gnawed at many. As famine and disease claimed comrades, some wondered whether they had been abandoned by the very God they fought for. For knights, glory and plunder were also powerful motivations. Victorious Crusaders looted cities, seizing gold, silver, silks, and slaves. But even this reward was fleeting. The riches of Jerusalem could not heal festering wounds, quench thirst, or silence the nightmares of slaughter. Many knights who survived returned home scarred, crippled, or haunted, their faith shaken despite their victories. For a modern person, the life of a Crusader knight would be unendurable. Imagine marching thousands of miles in blistering heat, starving in disease-ridden camps, fighting battles where survival depended on luck as much as skill. Imagine watching comrades die of thirst or cutting down women and children in the name of faith. The Crusades promised salvation, but the daily life of a Crusader was a crucible of suffering, brutality, and disillusionment. The myth of the shining knight in the Holy Land fades quickly when you see the truth. Beneath the banners of the cross, Crusaders lived in filth, fought in chaos, and died in agony. Faith carried them forward, but survival demanded more than prayers. It demanded the endurance of hell on earth.